Hello and welcome to Twist List. Today we are looking at 10 of the shortest reigning leaders in history. History is filled with rulers whose reigns lasted long after their welcome. However, some rulers were in charge for only brief periods of time. Here are 10 examples of the shortest reigning leaders throughout history whose reigns were cut short for bizarre and often unfortunate reasons. The fifth spot on the list is occupied by 86 days. Following the assassination of Pertinax on March 28, 193, the Praetorian Guards who killed him auctioned off the Roman Empire to the highest bidder. There were two men bidding, but Didius Julianus won by promising 25,000 sesterces to every soldier of the Praetorian Guard. This totaled approximately 200 million sesterces, or 50 million denarii. It is difficult to compare this to a modern currency, but an average worker or soldier in the empire earned about 1 denarii per day at the time. Fearing the military, the Senate proclaimed Julianus emperor, but his reign did not last. He was deposed and executed by his successor less than 3 months later on June 1, 193. Number 4 on the list is King Frederick Charles of Finland, serving from September 15 to September 27, 1590. Pope Urban VII was the shortest reigning pope in Catholic history following the Vatican's removal of Stephen II from the list of popes. Stephen II's 3-day reign was considered invalid because he missed his consecration. Urban VII left the papacy in a fairly normal manner after succumbing to malaria. However, he earned an asterisk in the history books as the first ruler to ever institute a smoking and tobacco ban in 1590. Urban VII threatened excommunication to any Catholic who took tobacco in a porchway of or inside a church, whether it be by chewing it, smoking it with a pipe, or sniffing it in powdered form through the nose. His ban on tobacco was not due to health concerns but to his distaste for it in and around the church. At the third place we have 5. Emperor Duk. Duk was both emplaced and executed by the same people after ruling Vietnam for only 3 days in July 1883. During his coronation ceremony, he committed several acts of debauchery. This violated various rules of mourning pertaining to the death of his father, whom Duk had succeeded to the throne. The Vietnamese court quickly ruled that he be poisoned to death for his debauchery. He may have been deposed for political reasons and left to die in captivity, but the true nature of his death is not known for certain. However, he was considered to be a puppet of French colonialists. Turmoil followed his 3-day rule for nearly a decade before a stable monarchy could take place under one of his sons. At the second spot is 65 days. Emperor Mo of Jin, named Wanyan Chenglin, was the shortest reigning emperor in Chinese history. On February 9, 1234, he was killed shortly after his coronation ceremony during the Mongol attack on China. That day, he had met with Emperor Aizong, his predecessor, who insisted that Chenglin accept his position as emperor. Soon after, during the siege of Kaizu, the city walls were breached. Emperor Aizong committed suicide to avoid capture and to allow for his successor to take his position. Chenglin was leader of the Jin dynasty for as little as 2 hours. He rallied his troops and defended the city until he was killed in battle, marking the end of the Jin dynasty and the beginning of Mongol Yuan rule of northern China. And finally, at number 1, Pope Urban VII. On August 2, 1830, Louis Antoine was technically the King of France for 20 minutes before he agreed to abdicate the throne. The rights of succession meant that he was king once his father had signed his own abdication papers during the July Revolution of 1830. While Louis Antoine pondered signing the abdication documents, he listened to his wife's arguments not to sign and to retain his role as king in what was considered to be an incredibly unpopular monarchy. but he eventually acquiesced and signed the papers. Although Louis Antoine never truly ruled over France, some of his followers never recognized his abdication as being legal and considered his father, Charles X, and then Louis to be the true kings of France until their respective deaths. Jonathan is a graphic artist, illustrator, and game designer with a few independently published games through his game company,
Morning
Talking
Attire
Bull
was very
Games.
strict.
He is
Due
an
to the
active
strict
duty
adherence to
soldier and
morning
enjoys
attire,
researching
it was
and
quite easy
writing
to
about
recognize
history,
not only who was in
science,
mourning but also
theology,
for how
and
long.
many other subjects.
And of course women were the main attractions of this particular fashion show. During the first 6 months of mourning, the widow was expected to wear a full-length dress made entirely of black crepe with white crepe collars and cuffs. On her head she would wear a crepe bonnet with a long crepe veil and a widow's cap also of white crepe with black kid gloves on her hands. All kinds of black fur and sealskin were also worn during this time. After 6 months, the crepe material was removed and after 3 months the widow's cap was removed. Now the widow could wear a dress made of silk gabardine, plain black grosgrain or crepe-trimmed cashmere with jet trimmings. She could also exchange the heavy crepe veil for a lighter one. As for the use of crepe and mourning veils, with burials, doctors were very much opposed to its little to no standards. Many doctors felt that when the burial of the deceased occurred in churchyards, many of which the black dye from the crepe material sheds over time the churchyards became so overflowing with dead bodies that the surrounding neighborhoods became decidedly unhealthy. The bodies were usually buried in shallow pits beneath the floorboards of chapels and schools. It is the very churchyards may seem to contain only a small number of gravestones. That we can actually suggest to mourners wearing it that they should pin a small veil of black tulle over the eyes and nose, was only 200 square feet, the heavy crepe as often as possible, square meters for health's sake. In length would in actuality contain 60 or 70,000 bodies. However, by the 1830s, however, things changed when veritable George Frederick Garden decided to create a commercial cemetery much like Paris's Père Lachaise, an exquisite park-like cemetery. At the third place was in 1831 when 55 acres of land in London's Kensal Green was purchased and thus was born London's first great cemetery. Was quite detailed and extreme. The rules were quite the opposite for dressing the deceased. The remains of a man were usually clad in his habit as he lived. A woman's remains, however, were usually dressed in a white robe and cap while children were dressed in white cashmere robes. As for the casket, it was usually made of hardwood or cast iron, especially if the deceased died from a highly contagious disease such as diphtheria or cholera. Typically, the coffin itself would remain plain on the outside save for a swath of black cloth while the inside was usually satin-lined. Another addition to the coffin's interior was usually a bell of some sort. Due to the contagious nature of diseases like smallpox, cholera and diphtheria as well as the misdiagnosis of cause for death. Unfortunately many people were actually buried alive in the Victorian powerful queen, but therefore was Victoria's influence felt more deeply than when she mourned the death of her beloved husband. Of bells and coffins became after Albert's sudden passing from typhoid fever in November 1861. Victoria became deeply depressed and soon turned mourning him into her chief concern for the rest of her days. Shortly after Albert died, Victoria instructed her servants to maintain the prince's rooms exactly as he had them when he was alive. They were also instructed to bring hot water to his dressing room for his morning shave just as they always did and to dress in black for the first 3 years after his death. Victoria, however, continued wearing black for the rest of her life. Victoria continued mourning Albert by having statues made of him, displaying his mementos around the royal palaces and staying secluded in Windsor Castle for many years after his death. After several years of this, to celebrate the public became quite concerned about her sanity, showed how the Victorians' popularity and feared their mortality. The British public took on her there were several nightclubs that actually celebrated death. Mourning was in the neighborhood of Montmartre. One could ponder their mortality in the aptly named Cabaret du Néant, the Cabaret of Nothingness. At this Gothic night spot, visitors were served by monks and funeral attendees who offered drinks named after diseases which were imbibed on top of coffins and caskets. At Cabaret de l'Enfer, the Cabaret of the Inferno, patrons would be greeted by a chorus of voices shouting "Enter and be damned, the evil one awaits you." At this satanically themed nightclub, a half-dozen devil musicians, both male and female, would be suspended in a cauldron over a fire, playing selections from Faust's red imps stood with hot irons ready to prod those musicians who dared miss a beat. Throughout the room, other red imps would serve beverages or do somersaults as crevices in the walls would suddenly spew thick smoke and emit odors of volcanoes while flames would suddenly burst from clefts in the rocks. And of course, what would hell be without heaven? So right next to the Cabaret of the Inferno stood the Cabaret du Ciel, the Cabaret of the Sky. At this heavenly themed bar, patrons were greeted by Dante and Father Time, served drinks by attractive ladies dressed as angels and were entertained by St. Peter himself.